Welcome to another God and Country class. And actually, we have a special treat. Of course, our motto, or our purpose here, learning about America's godly heritage, good economics, and the proper role of government. And our motto, snacks, friends, and saving our country. Of course, before we get into our 5,000 Year Leap book, I have a little treat for us. And what it is a little bit of perspective. So, sometimes when we get really focused on an issue, we can get tunnel vision. And we can forget about history, we can forget about the big picture, and we think that our problem is the only problem that has ever existed, and it's unique, and no one in the world's ever gone through something like this, and it's just, it's a disaster. And we just get very despondent, thinking that, no one's ever been through something like this. I'm very unique. And we can do that with our history too, forgetting that oftentimes we've been there before. This is actually James Robison, and he's speaking. This is within this last year, I believe. And I want us to take away a few things from it. Number one is that we're not alone in this room. And even in Goochland, we're not alone. And that there are people all over the United States, even on Christian television, who I believe are a part of the same movement. And over the course of American history, we've had one and two great awakenings. We've had two great awakenings, spiritual awakenings that affected our country. And I humbly propose that we may be entering another great awakening. Because it's not just us in this room that feel the things that we feel. It's not just us that have the same concerns. I really believe that the Lord is waking up His people to do something again. And this is just one more little piece that somewhere else, in some TV studio, somewhere else in the United States, someone has been thinking the same things that we've been thinking, and this is how he put it.
Prosperity and blessing and productivity consumed by foolishness and by an invading army that walks in lockstep, diverse and cruel. And that's what we've got today, consuming all of our productivity. We've got all these strange bedfellows, but they're all putting God aside. Or they pay Him some meaningless tribute, but they don't love Him and love others. And they try to justify all manner of evil. They call good evil and evil good. We desperately need healing. So it reminded me, as I've said, God, I've watched you do miracles. It reminded me years ago. I'm in my mid-30s. And Billy Graham called a prayer meeting. And about 8 or 10 of us gathered. I've told you before, Charles Stanley and Adrian Rogers and others that you would know just came together, but it was primarily Billy's heart. He said, we've got 1,000 days of freedom. I've heard God. The Soviet threat is going to take freedom down in the United States and around the world. I stood in Moscow and I heard it. Bill Bright was there too. The two of them asked several of us to come and pray for 2 days. And Bill Bright said, I heard exactly the same thing. And they said, we've got to pray. And they said, we've got to have principled leadership. Not just people who talk religion, but principled leadership that can communicate with conviction what needs to happen. A series of miracles occurred. Billy said, I have to sit in the background and pray. I remember so clearly how Charles Stanley and Adrian Rogers and I and a few others said, we'll lay our lives down to speak truth to this nation. Had a great prayer meeting in Washington in the spring. It was called Washington for Jesus, nearly 1 million people. And God led me to call a meeting called the National Affairs Briefing. And invite all the presidential candidates that would be on the scene at that time. Only one said he would come. And none of his advisors wanted him to come. They were 100% against it. I think maybe Jerry Naylor, who was the events coordinator, who took Buddy Holly's place when Buddy Holly and the Crickets, when Buddy Holly died, Jerry came in as the lead singer. I think he wanted him to do it. But Reagan knew God wanted him to do it. So he joined me for what was called the National Affairs Briefing. The media reported that 50 million people were impacted by what happened there, and the whole community of faith and people that love freedom. And I preached. Then Governor Reagan sat and listened, along with the 17,000 other people in Reunion Arena. It was a miracle answer to prayer. Let me tell you what it did. It began a movement of transformation in thinking that saved freedom here in the United States, around the world, and brought down the Soviet threat. Let's look in on that meeting.
One of the most outstanding preachers in our country has preached to over 10 million people, 500,000 people that profess faith in Jesus Christ, the Vice President of the Round Table, a man who was greatly responsible for this meeting coming to pass. One of God's great servants in this time. Won't you welcome James Robinson?
I really appreciate the fact that I know you are not applauding men tonight. I am convinced that you are applauding the greatest country on the face of this earth, and you want it to remain the greatest country on the face of this earth. I am convinced that it is the greatest country on the face of this earth because of its heritage and its foundation. Proverbs 29, verse 2. When the righteous are in authority, the people rejoice. But when the wicked beareth rule, the people mourn. Proverbs 14:34, righteousness exalteth a nation, but sin is a reproach to any people. There is no possible way that you can separate God from government and have a successful government. God is the ultimate authority. I tire of the constant reference to Christians and to religious people and the term separation of church and state, implying that if you belong to a church or if you claim faith in God and believe in God, you are to have no basic influential part in political activity or policy making. If the righteous, the pro-family, the moral, the biblical, the godly, the hardworking, and the decent individuals in this country stay out of politics, who on this earth does that leave to make the policies under which you and I live and struggle to survive? Neither our founding fathers or Jesus Christ initiated the godless interpretation of separation of church and state as it is presently presented to so many American people. For Jesus said, you are the salt of the earth. If we live in unsavory times, and we do, it is because there is a deficiency of the sacred salt that gives flavor to all life on this earth. We must begin to literally penetrate every area of our society. Yes, even the political area. How do you expect the godly, the decent, the moral, those who have not sold out to some special power or special interest group, how do you expect them to get elected if godly people do not support them and vote for them? How can you expect any politician or any political candidate to stand for principle if the people who believe in principle don't even vote and stand behind them? We're the guilty ones. If there is darkness in the land, It is because of a scarcity of light. Jesus said, put the light on the lampstand, not under the bushel. I would highly suggest you read the book sometimes. It won't hurt the media. It won't hurt politicians. There is marvelous healing in this book. And it needs to be applied to the cancerous visible sores that embarrass us before the whole world right now. And we'd better apply the one cure. If you think our solution is political, you too have been deceived. Don't you commit yourself to some political party or politician. You commit yourself to the principles of God and demand those parties and politicians align themselves with the eternal values in this book, and America will be forever the greatest nation on this earth.
Yeah.
I've been told this book doesn't say anything about economics. I want you to know this is the one reliable economics book you can read. It is a historical book. It is a scientific book. It has a vast amount of medical knowledge and wisdom. This is the one book upon which you can rely. I'll tell you one thing. This book will teach you about your economy. It'll teach you what we're doing will destroy any nation on earth right now. I wonder how long it's going to take the American people to begin to play the suicidal economic game of our current government. Suppose at tax time next year we find ourselves a little short. Why not just take a roll of toilet paper, unroll it, and print up some more money if you're short? That's what they do when they need money. And the money they're printing is as worthless as toilet tissue. Wait a minute. Wait a minute. Would you dare to suggest that people print up money that's deflated and worthless? You'll be locked up. What I want to know is, when are we going to get smart and lock up the people that are paying their bills with valueless money by printing it up whenever they need it? Who's going to lock up that unbridled, excessive, uncontrolled federal government? You better believe it. I'm wondering, as one who was a minority, I lived in an area where 10% of the people were white, the rest were blacks and Latin American. I was a minority. I was poor. I was very poor. I didn't need a handout. I needed someone to put a hand out and get involved with me. And before you applaud, I want to address the hypocrisy in this room. You want to know why we've got such a terrible, terrible attitude right now toward the needy in this country, and we've been deceived into believing that the government can spend our way out of debt and pay off the poor? Where are they going to get all that money they're promising now recently, the billions and billions of dollars? Where are they going to get all that money? Who's going to produce it? Don't you know the government doesn't produce anything and was never intended to? It's a protector. It's not a provider, and it's certainly not a producer. It's a confiscator and a consumer and a disperser of your wealth. It produces nothing. And it will function best when it functions least. It is a regulator. It is not a provider, and certainly not a producer. I'd like to know what on earth ever gave the politicians the idea they could run our business. Look what a mess they've made of their business. I wish they'd butt out of our business. You say, what's the answer to the economic problem? I want to tell you, folks, quit criticizing the system, the welfare programs, and get out there in the ditch with people that need help and get dirty with them until you get them out. You got no business applauding until you're willing to get in the ditch with people. Folks, we'd better get back to God. I believe we need to send a message to Washington and send it loud and clear. If this nation is to be great, it won't be one nation under government, and it doesn't say on our coins, one nation under government, and it doesn't say in our pledge, a nation under God, or in government we trust, or one nation under government. It says one nation under God, in God we trust. I am convinced unless we trust in God, this nation is finished. I thank God Mr. Reagan was willing to come here tonight, because it took a lot of concern about what you think and a lot of courage for him to walk in here tonight and speak to you. And I want to thank him for coming. May God bless America, because America once again blesses God. Thank you, and God bless you.
Thank you. Please. That's awesome, man. Okay. Thank you. Thank you. Our two good governors who are here, Dr. Criswell, Dr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen here on the platform, and you ladies and gentlemen. You know, a few days ago, I addressed a group in Chicago and received their endorsement for my candidacy. Now, I know this is a nonpartisan gathering, and so I know that you can't endorse me, but I only brought that up because I want you to know that I endorse you and what you are doing.
I want you to know that without any question, history was changed by the power of God, the power of prayer, and Christians taking a stand, coming out from undercover, becoming a light, not only set on a lampstand to affect people around them, but we became as believers a shining city. And everything changed right there. We had a Sunday school teacher from our own denomination, Southern Baptist, in the White House. We were not having the principal decisions made to reduce terribly excessive taxation that was crippling us, to stop mutual assured destruction and get rid of the SALT Treaty, which I did a nationwide special exposing the danger of that, where military advisors had given me the insight. General Daniel Graham, who joined with Mr. Reagan, was head of the Strategic Defense Initiative for the entire 8 years that Mr. Reagan was president. The Soviet threat was weakened, diminished, and ultimately collapsed. And freedom, as we've known it, was spared. And it happened. It happened because God's people stood up and said, we've got to get someone who has convictions and principles and will limit the government. We don't need Pharaoh. Never worked, never will. What I preached, and you heard me preaching, is 100% applicable to this moment in the life of our nation. Right now. This moment.
What are some of your thoughts from that message there, from what he was saying? What are y'all thinking?
It just sounds so current. You know, it just sounds like he's, in 1980, he was talking about today.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, talking about printing off more money, and it's sort of worth, toilet paper. I mean, that was in 1980, 34 years ago. We would love to have 1980 national debt right now.
Right.
I mean, we would think that a miracle had occurred if we had the kind of problems they had back then, and yet the spiritual leaders thought it was that big of a deal that they needed to call that sort of meeting and engage in that sort of prayer, etc. So if it was that bad in 1980, it's so much worse now. But I think what he's saying is we need the same thing to happen. Is we need really Christians. Remember what he said about the salt and the light. In other words, if our nation is dark, it's because there's a scarcity of light. Or if we live in an unsavory nation, it's because there is a scarcity of that sacred salt that is not being applied to basically all the sectors of life. And he was saying we need to get in there. We need to infiltrate, is what he was saying. We need to penetrate all areas of life, especially politics, especially the government. And anyway, so you saw Ronald Reagan sitting there, and he was applauding. I mean,
grinning from ear to ear.
Yeah.
grinning from ear to ear. And I mean, I don't know what you think about when you look at Ronald Reagan, but I just think that is a classy man. I mean, he reminds me of my grandpa. He reminds me of my pop. You know, the way that they would just sit there with their suits on, and it's almost prestigious. But it's a humble person you're looking at, not some sort of haughty individual. But when I look at him, I just think, wow, to have someone like that. There are many narratives, there are many things that were going on at the time, I'm sure, but his narrative that James Robinson was describing is that this happened in part because God's people got serious and prayed, and they realized that they needed to get involved. And you know, the threat of the day then was nuclear war between the Soviets and the Americans. And you think about today, I mean, we've got the national debt, we've got, you know, the taxation that's going on, we've got immorality, but, you know, what's the global threat we think about today? Yeah, radical Islam, the terrorists, you know, people strapping bombs onto themselves and driving into populated areas, or flying airplanes into buildings, or ISIS marching across Iraq and Syria and these other places. And you know, this is of course speculation, but you know, if a nation gets away from the Lord, then some degree of protection may be lifted. And you know, when God's people got very serious about it, we got a godly man in office, a good man, a smart man that could communicate with the people with conviction, and the Soviet threat was eliminated. We've gotten away from God again, and we have many of the same problems, and now it's not a Soviet threat that we're necessarily concerned about, but it's terrorism. And the assumption is that if we get back to God again, if God's people get serious again, that we can once again have prosperity and security and all the things that a nation should have with proper leadership. So that's the idea, and I just wanted us to see that. I really believe this is a movement.
Very profitable years for this country.
Right.
In business, I mean, I can remember, 401ks just shot through the roof. And they were very, very profitable years for America.
Right. Right. And really, there's nothing that says it can't happen again. There's nothing that says it can't happen more.
I've never seen that. That's awesome.
It's pretty good. And that's just more evidence that I think God is doing something. You know, because it's not just us in this room, it's not just the concerned individuals that you talk to on a regular basis, but all across the country, people are waking up, people with the Holy Spirit in them, realizing something bad is happening and we need to do something about it. 28 Great Ideas That Changed the World, from the book The 5,000 Year Leap by W. Cleon Skousen. The idea being that something happened in history after thousands of years of technology and innovation sort of creeping along, that all of a sudden there was a boom, there was an explosion of innovation, of wealth creation, etc. And it all happened at this epicenter called America. So these 28 principles are the principles that essentially gave rise to that boom, that 5,000 year leap. 16th principle: the government should be separated into 3 branches: legislative, executive, and judicial. Polybius said, another one of our political philosophers that the founding fathers studied, monarchy could easily become tyranny, aristocracy sink into oligarchy, which is the oppressive government by a few rich families, and a democracy could turn into mob rule of force and violence. So in other words, they put into place the principles in our Constitution, in our system of government, those things to avoid the rising of tyranny or of aristocracy, etc. and certainly not democracy. As we remember from last week, the Founding Fathers hated democracies. They studied democracies and found that they had violent deaths, horrible deaths, essentially, as Polybius is describing now, mob rule is what democracy turned into. So remember, we do not have a republic, we do not have a democracy, we have a republic intentionally. And in order to avoid these various kinds of oppressive government, they gave us 3 separate branches. 17th principle. A system of checks and balances should be adopted to prevent the abuse of power. James Madison said the trick is to separate the powers and then delicately lace them back together again as a balanced unit. It is equally evident that none of them ought to possess, directly or indirectly, an overruling influence over the others in the administration of their respective powers. Now, can you think of anything in recent current events where someone in our government was making statements that showed they did not truly believe in a system of check and balances, but that they were going to do things unilaterally? What is the phrase that comes to mind?
Well, that would be our president. And
what's his famous or his infamous phrase?
executive order.
Executive order, but what 2 things did he say he had? Not Congress and the judicial, but what 2 things did he say he had that he could use? Remember?
Oh, yeah. Telephone and a pen.
That's right. He said he had a pen and a phone, and that was how he was going to move his agenda forward. If the Founding Fathers, if James Madison would hear a sitting president, United States president, say that he was going to rule, so to speak, that he was going to lead and to legislate by pen and phone, the phrase roll over in their graves doesn't really do it justice. They might just leap out of their graves. I mean, the idea that someone will be president with a pen and a phone, if you listen to the rhetoric when someone in the administration talks about Congress, it's interesting. Even tonight, was it Jen Psaki, spokesperson for State Department, but she gave away that very, very crucial phrase. If you listen to it, it shows what they really think about Congress in the presidential branch. But she said that she was going to consult and get the input of Congress. In other words, Congress to them is a consulting group, someone to give them input on their decisions. But if you notice that time and time again, whether it be the president or someone speaking for him, they don't say something about a bill passing Congress. They say they want to get the input and the consultation of Congress, essentially relegating them to a large group of highly paid consultants. 18th principle, the unalienable rights of the people are most likely to be preserved if the principles of government are set forth in a written constitution. Skousen has noted, our author, that the Anglo-Saxons, which is another one of the cultures that the Founding Fathers studied, their common law was that it was unwritten, in fact. Since its principles were known amongst the whole people, they seemed indifferent to the necessity of writing them down. Through the centuries, the British have tried to maintain their political affairs with no written constitution and have merely relied on fragmentary statutes as a constitutional reference source. The American founders felt that the structure of government should be codified in a more permanent, comprehensive form. It will be appreciated, therefore, that the tradition of written constitutions in modern times is not of English origin, but is entirely American, both in principle and practice. So, like in the Anglo-Saxon culture, everyone knew the law, so they did not think it was necessary to write it down. But could you imagine nowadays, where many of us, even those of us who are pretty educated, still don't know the Constitution? Could you imagine if we had never written it down?
Oh, no.
The chaos that would ensue. In other words, we would have nothing to go back on because it really has not been taught widely. And so, could you imagine if the founders had not chosen to give us a written constitution? I don't even want to think about that.
No, I don't think that we would have a country today
Right.
if that.
So we wouldn't be here.
No, it wouldn't
Right.
be a couple hundred years, no.
But So thank God that they did choose to actually write it down, but just think about the necessity of an objective standard. In other words, what if we did not have a written Bible, a written Word of God? Well, you could have people just making stuff up.
Well, it's bad enough that they do now.
That's right. Well, you don't read it.
Reading
Someone
between
doesn't
the
read it.
lines, so this is what they really meant. Now you're applying today's interpretation to a document that was written then. You need to apply their interpretation to it, but that's the way they...
All right. Well, and you could just imagine the abuse that would go on if we didn't have a written Word of God, a written Bible. I mean, someone could just make up, well, hey, have you heard about, Saint Jason? You know, the word of Saint Jason in 310, that every Thursday you're supposed to give me $100 in a back rub. I mean, just the abuse that would go on. I mean, so having something written down was absolutely essential for our form of government. 19th principle, only limited and carefully defined powers should be delegated to the government, all others being retained in the people. So our 10th Amendment says, the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. So essentially, our 10th Amendment to the Constitution says that if it doesn't say it, they can't do it. Essentially, the Constitution is a limiting document saying, federal government, this is what you can do, and if we did not expressly tell you you can do it, it's reserved for the states or the people individually. So if you don't find it in there, can't do it. 20th principle. Efficiency and dispatch require government to operate according to the will of the majority, but constitutional provisions must be made to protect the rights of the minority. This is in contrast to unanimous consent, where everyone has to agree. That would be another way to do things, which, you can never get everyone to agree on something. We know that. And it's also in contrast to the tyranny of the minority. So some people might say today that we have culturally a tyranny of the minority, where basically it's just a loud few who really turn the tides in our culture. And we can name any number of instances where that has happened and is happening. But essentially, we want to protect the rights of the minority, but it is the will of the majority which dictates the direction our government is going to go. 21st principle. Strong local self-government is the keystone to preserving human freedom. John Adams said, there is something very unnatural and odious, it stinks, in a government 1,000 leagues off. A whole government of our own choice, managed by persons whom we love, revere, and can confide in, has charms in it for which men will fight. In other words, if we are making our own decisions, if we are making our own laws and our own rules, if it's people who live like us, drive the same streets as us, shop in the same stores as us, they can relate to us. And they're not going to make a law that is completely disjointed from applicable life. So in other words, when someone in Washington, D.C. is making very, very specific laws for Goochland County, Virginia, something's wrong. In other words, there are some big picture universal laws that govern us all, these natural laws. And there are some constitutional provisions for us all that are recognized. But essentially, it should be a strong local body who are making the laws for people in their own region. And that, John Adams says, that's what people will fight for. 22nd principle, almost finished. A free people should be governed by law and not by whims of men. John Adams said, a government of laws and not of men. No man will contend that a nation can be free that is not governed by fixed laws. All other government than that of permanent known laws is the government of mere will and pleasure. So, when we say someone ruling by their own just emotions and pleasures and will and not following the law, what are some names that pop up? Obama. Eric Holder is my favorite example because he's the chief law enforcement officer in the whole land, and yet he's lawless. He essentially picks and chooses which laws he's going to enforce if they meet his agenda, And if they don't fit into his little circle of things he cares about, he's not going to do anything about it.
Can't think of any of them that he's enforced.
Well, I think that if it has to do with some sort of minority issue or something like that, he's going to go after it with fervor. But if it doesn't have to do with something that fits in a very, very small sphere, he's not interested. All right, 23rd principle. We can have fun with that last one all day long. A free society cannot survive as a republic without a broad program of general education. Thomas Jefferson. If a nation expects to be ignorant and free in a state of civilization, it expects what never was and never will be. Article 3. James, could you read that, please?
Religion, morality, and knowledge being necessary to good government and the happiness of mankind, schools and the means of education shall forever be encouraged.
All right, so relating this Northwest Ordinance back to what Thomas Jefferson just told us, what can we assume the founders wanted our education system to look like? What can we assume they wanted to include?
Religion.
That's right.
Morals.
That's right. That's right. But now what?
Moral absolutes, yeah.
That's right. The Bible is now one of those banned books.
Oh, yeah.
Or no, you can't start a Bible club here at school. Heaven forbid we actually teach morality. But Jefferson, of course, is saying that you have to have an educated electorate if you want to, of course, survive as a republic. So, if we can also remember what Ben Franklin said and John Adams said, our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. And Ben Franklin said, as nations become more corrupt and vicious, the more need they have of masters. So essentially, if you take Jefferson, if you take Adams, and if you take Franklin together, you essentially need two pieces to survive as a republic, as a constitutional republic with limited government. You need morality, which of course comes from religion, which we understand to be from the Bible. So you need virtuous, moral people, and you need an educated people. Without those two things, you can't have a free society. Essentially, if people are not regulating themselves, then someone else is going to come and regulate over them. I think about the idea that we go into a country and we knock it down and we have victory over an enemy, and then we erect a democracy. Well, what are some of the problems with that? Number one, what are we not? So why are we going to implement a democracy if a democracy does not work? But also, how can you go to a country where they are illiterate, where they are immoral, where they are essentially vicious and savage, and think that you're going to give them a country like America? It doesn't work. You can't simply give someone voting rights and think that's going to erect a grand republic.
And that you're going to have freedom.
Exactly, and that you're going to have freedom. So when you're thinking about, now I'm not talking about one president over another or one war over another, but the point is that you can't just go somewhere, give someone voting rights, and expect everything to work out well. They need to be educated and moral, or you're still going to have chaos. 24th principle. A free people will not survive unless they stay strong. Ben Franklin. Were this union formed, were we once united, thoroughly armed and disciplined, were everything in our power done for our security, as far as human means and foresight could provide, we might then, with more propriety, humbly ask the assistance of heaven and a blessing on our lawful endeavors. Ronald Reagan. We maintain the peace through our strength. Weakness only invites aggression. Going back to the Franklin quote, essentially what he's saying is that we do everything we can do to take care of ourselves. We put in place all of the measures for our own security, and then we can properly ask God to protect us. In other words, it's sort of like going into the bad part of town, in your swimsuit and sandals, and walking around with your shirt off and just all exposed, and walking around at nighttime and thinking, okay, Lord, protect me. Well, maybe you should do something to protect yourself. So in other words, there's a point of human responsibility that needs to take place before you can responsibly ask heaven to bless that endeavor. And that's what Franklin was saying. Ronald Reagan said it, we maintain the peace through our strength. Weakness only invites aggression. And what is the phrase? Nature abhors a vacuum. So in other words, if there is a leadership vacuum in the world, if there is a power vacuum, if there's no longer one person standing there as the strong man, someone's going to fill that spot. And so people right now, nations are contending as to who that will be. In other words, you've got the ISIS candidate. They're trying to be the big man in the room. You've got Vladimir Putin running around, sort of, with his barrel chest all, bare and, manly and all that, just trying to assert himself. And he's done it without much buffering from the West. And so I don't know what China's doing or what Iran's going to do, but essentially we have backed out as that strong person internationally, that strong man in the room, and we've got international chaos. So Ronald Reagan said, we maintain the peace through our strength. Weakness only invites aggression. And I think that's what we're seeing right now. And that does not mean that you get involved everywhere and everything. There's a smart way to do it. But essentially what we're seeing is that this brand of foreign policy, the leave them alone and they'll leave you alone type policy, does not necessarily work. 25th principle. Peace, commerce, and honest friendship with all nations, entangling alliances with none. Excuse me. This is separatism, not isolationism. So Washington said, the great rule of conduct for us in regard to foreign nations is in extending our commerce or our commercial relations to have with them as little political connection as possible. So, in other words, this is sort of what the libertarians are taking as their foreign policy, that if you are engaging in commerce with nations, the less reason they'll have to fight you. In other words, we will probably not go to war with Mexico anytime soon because, they make a lot of our things and we buy their things. The entangling alliance, I think that would be more so like a treaty that says anyone that messes with you will go to war with you. In other words, I think this was more so about, we don't want to make a treaty with France saying if anytime you get in any kind of tiff with any other country, we'll come be by your side no matter what. What Washington is saying here is sort of like the libertarian foreign policy, which is we're going to trade with people, and because we're going to trade with them, we're going to have much less reason to go to war. Now, of course, this is not the entirety of Washington's foreign policy, and even Thomas Jefferson, created the Marines to go after the Muslim pirates that were attacking our ships off of Tripoli. And so essentially, even our founders, got involved in foreign affairs militarily when it was going to meet our needs. But this part of it says, peace, commerce, and honest friendship with all nations, entangling alliances with none. That way we don't have to go to war every time someone else goes to war. Yet, we do still have a manifest destiny, which we'll talk about during the time of discussing the 28th principle. 26th, the core unit which determines the strength of any society is the family. Therefore, the government should foster and protect its integrity. Cleon Skousen, our author, said it will be appreciated that the strength and stability of the family is of such vital importance to the culture that any action by the government to debilitate or cause dislocation in the normal trilateral structure of the family becomes not merely a threat to the family involved, but a menace to the very foundation of society itself. So this is something you're not really going to hear a lot of political philosophers talk about today, but essentially we've got three pillars of our society. There's your triangle again. But you've got the family, you've got the government, and you've got the church. And anytime you mess with any of those institutions, you get one of those wrong, you really start to have a decay in society. And the family has been almost completely obliterated. And this is actually one of the reasons why the homosexual marriage issue is bigger than just two people in love. Because if you attack the family, and if you can call a family anything you want to call it, well then you've almost completely destroyed your society. There's numerous studies regarding the war on poverty since the 60s. All these efforts to help people in need have actually hurt them. Basically given incentives to be single and have children, essentially, and the more children you have, the more assistance you get. Well, this is something that hurts the family, that incentivizes the dislocation of the family. And there have been numerous studies to show that since this war on poverty, essentially the family unit in these culture groups that have been affected has gone down. Of course, the politicians use this to buy their votes, essentially. So they have an incentive to keep those programs in place. But essentially, our government is doing things to hurt the family, not help it. And our author says that if you mess up the family, you mess up your country. And there's also numerous studies out there, rather conclusive, saying that children that grow up outside of a stable family, father and a mother in the home, the crime rate increases among those individuals, the education rate declines greatly. So, if you've got orphans, someone's got to take care of them, and oftentimes that becomes the state. So in many, many instances, we see how the destruction of the family really is the degradation of society. 27th principle, almost done. The burden of debt is as destructive to freedom as subjugation by conquest. In other words, it is as slavery. Franklin said, "Think what you do when you run in debt. You give to another the power over your liberty."
It's true.
As you were saying earlier. Jefferson said it, "I, however, place economy among the first and most important of republican virtues, and public debt as the greatest of the dangers to be feared." And also talking about the immorality of passing on your debt to future generations, and how immoral that is. The idea of how proper it is to pay off your debts in the generation that they were incurred. And of course, we have not done that at all. And I remember at the beginning of our class, the picture of the little girl with the sign that said, "I'm only 5 years old, all I own is this bike, and I'm already $34,000 in debt," or whatever it is. So, our founders understood what it was to see the danger of being in debt. 28th principle, our last principle. The United States has a manifest destiny to be an example and a blessing to the entire human race. Now, of course, this is different than your democratic nation building. This is something else. John Adams said, "I always consider the settlement of America with reverence and wonder, as the opening of a grand scene and design in Providence for the illumination of the ignorant and the emancipation of the slavish part of mankind all over the earth." Madison said, "Happily for America, happily we trust for the whole human race, they, the founders, pursued a new and more noble course." Jefferson said, "The United States will be a standing monument and example for the aim and imitation of the people of other countries." So in other words, we're to be that shining city upon a hill. We are to be a country that other countries look at and say, "We want to do that. How do you do that?" And then because we know the principles, we say, well, first you've got to be virtuous. So if you want to help another country out, you actually send missionaries. Now I know that that's far beyond what most people are willing to say, but essentially people need to become moral first, and we know that true morality comes from the Bible. So if you really want to start laying a foundation for a people to be free, don't just give them ballots, give them the Bible. Teach them to be moral and virtuous. And then what did Thomas Jefferson say you had to be? You had to be educated. So essentially, someone says, "We want to be like you, America. What can we do?" First you say, Jesus, the Bible, give them a foundation for morality. And then you say, now, become educated. And then they become ready to become a republic under a form of limited constitutional government.